Let's take a look at the Dancing Wing models version of the Fieseler Fi-156 Storch. In this part of our assembly video for the Fieseler Fi-156 Storch, we'll be working on the wings, the electronics, and the final assembly. Okay, and here in step 3, we're going to start work on the wings, and the first thing it asks you to do is to use the CA hinges and mount the flaps and the ailerons. Now, one of the things I found about this kit is that on these control surfaces, you know, the surface here, the width of the wing is wider, and so the slots were better cut than they were on the horizontal stabilizer and the elevator. And so what I've done is I'm kind of using the same technique. I've got the little straight pin here for spacing in the middle of that CA or that polyester hinge. But then I've mounted it all. So they're all mounted now, and I've yet to put the CA in. And now I'm going to go in with my thin CA, and as I did before, just dribble a little of that CA on each of the polyester hinges, allow it to wick into the structure that the hinge is slotted in, and as opposed to doing one side and then the other. This is probably better. It helps with the alignment. You know that you're aligned, but it's certainly easier to do when you've got nice slots made for your hinges, which in the case of the wings of this model, you certainly do. Okay, so as you can see, I've done quite a bit of work here on the wing. Most of it's kind of meticulous kind of stuff. It's not easy to video, so let me explain to you what I've done. First, the leading edge slat is a very interesting component to this airplane, kind of ahead of its time, actually. But to do that, there are some little rounded pieces of plywood that come on a black sheet, and they fit into little slots at each of these spots. And I used some medium weight CA. So I'd have some medium or thick CA for some of these parts. The thing to watch out for with all of these guys right here is that you want to make sure that they are parallel, because the other little nub that is exactly the same, except it's a single piece coming from the slat itself, is going to fit on a little nut. And so you want to have some room for that. You don't want a lot of friction because these are fairly small servos. So you want to make sure that those are aligned, that they're straight, and when you set the piece aside to dry, double check to make sure that those little pieces haven't moved. Now, on the slat itself, again, as I mentioned, those same little pieces with a hole in the end fit nicely into the slots here on the leading edge slat. And then there's a package of little screws that have a machine screw and a nut on each one. Now, what I've done with those is that I've put them on, snugged them up, wiggled the slat, and when I found it was too stiff, I started loosening them until I got to the point where I was happy with the movement of the slat. And so that means these are fairly loose. Now, I don't want them to vibrate off, so I put a drop of medium blue colored thread locker on each of those nuts. So it can stay loose across the span of that hinge, but at the same time, the nut isn't going to back off. Here is the actuator for the leading edge slats. And then you can see that there were some scale pieces out of that same black material here on the aileron. It's going to limit the throw of the aileron, I think, and it may be kind of an aeronautical counterweight perhaps on the full-scale airplane. Here on the flaps, we've got the same thing. These little pieces are scale pieces here. And then I moved into doing some decals. At this point, I had to go into Google Images to find a picture of an actual Storch, and I found one that was full-scale flying model with the 4-letter nomenclature on it. And so I did that, and this is how it's done. So the cross goes right at the edge of the yellow. The first letter of the nomenclature, or the tail number, if you will, goes in the yellow. The second letter goes up next to the servos. There's a bar right here on the interior of the wing and right here, and that's where the wing struts are going to screw in. And so at this point, putting the decals on was probably the smart move, so that I haven't blocked the decals with other pieces that make it more difficult to put the decal on the airplane. The next thing I want to call to your attention is the servos. And so I've got that started now. And so the servos go on the back of these covers, and there's a package of little wooden knobs that you can see here. And so I found a servo, put the servo horn on it, and then centered the servo on this piece with the horn sticking through the slot. And then I marked the little blocks, and then I went back and put some medium CA on them and glued them down and let them set overnight. And then I came back and mounted the servos. Now they're mounted with screws going into these little pieces of wood. And so I've got them all set up here. Down here on the flaps, you can see that there's a place for one of the flap actuator or control horns, if you will, right here, and there's another one right here, and that equates to taking this and flipping it. And if I flipped it like that, then of course it's going to be moving the same direction as the one on the other wing. And so I'm hoping that that's going to work. When I get my radio programmed up, then I'll know for sure. But that's why I haven't glued those in yet, and that's why I haven't cinched these down yet. I had a piece of music wire in the workshop that I used to slide in through the end and grab the servo wires. The one from this side, the aileron, is the one with the servo extension on it. And the servo wire itself makes it all the way through the wing. It just wouldn't make it down into the cockpit where the receiver is going to be mounted. So I've got all these servos, I've got them all labeled, and then you'll notice that I've taken the connector off, and I'm going to show you that here in just a minute when we talk about some things on the fuselage. But I've taken the connector piece off, and so now I've got the wing all done. Everything's moving to include the leading edge slats there. And so now this wing's done, the other wing's done, and I'm just about ready to pre-wire the radio to make sure that I've got everything moving in the right direction. Each of these little pieces of corner where these hatches are going to screw in, I put a drop of CA on to harden the wood, and I'm going to be ready to cinch those down as soon as I verify that I've got the servos moving the right direction. So that's it for the wings. So now let's go in and take a look at some things we've done with the fuselage. So here we are with the fuselage, and a couple of things I want to point out to you. These are the two connectors that I took off the wings. There's a screw right here that goes through the wing and through a little flat piece that would allow it to pivot. And then there is this little sleeve of carbon fiber tube right here and right here. And then there's a longer sleeve right here that goes across. And then in your kit, you'll find a small piece that has an outside diameter, which is the same as the interior diameter here. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take this piece, and it just kind of fits through the side wall of the fuselage with this little piece because it sticks out just a little bit on the other side. And then you're going to push this larger piece straight through into the other side of the fuselage, and do the same thing with the other wing. And what that's going to do then, when we put the screws on and we put the master spar through, then these two things are going to fit together. So it's not glued in, it's just kind of snapped in. The instructions say to connect it, and so that's what we've done. But at this point, we're going to assume that it's going to be strong enough since those spars go completely through and will be attaching the wings. The other thing then, we're going to look inside, but we see that we've got the metal attachment point down here. and that just slid in. And let me move this so we can see inside the fuselage bed, and you'll see where that connects. So now peeking inside, we see down here on the floor of the cockpit was a screw that was in a connector down there. It just screwed out. It's a machine screw, and so when we slid that metal in, we just matched the holes together and screwed that in, and so that worked out very easily. It's just right down there. It might kind of be hard to see there in the dark, but there's one on each side. And then the other thing we did is we mounted the servos on the inside. That proved to be a little bit more of a pain because the blocks here that the servos are connected to here and here are just exactly the right size to fit the servo, except the servo, of course, has a wire coming out, and the servos with this kit, the wire comes out on the side, which means that there's going to be some filing and some sanding on the side where the wire comes out for it to fit, because it is such a snug fit. Because the wire goes down through the floor and then it comes back up through one of these holes, and we'll mount that to the receiver. That wasn't nearly as easy as it could have been, but it's certainly understandable because you want the servos to screw in on those wood blocks. It's just that you got to make room for the wire. I've got one more thing to show you here as regards to the fuselage. Okay, so here's our tail wheel assembly. You know, we glued it into the rudder when we assembled the rudder, but now I've got that in. So I used my thumb vise, started some holes in the block of wood that's right here. These are 15mm long self-tapping screws, wood screws if you will, that go into the block to hold this tight. And so I've got that in there. Then I've got the little collet snugged up so that this is taking the weight of any bumps on the tail wheel, not the little soft balsa right here. So that's our tail wheel assembly. And then one last thing, here you can see that I've got the decals on the side of the airplane, again using Google for some images of this airplane. And so it's a 4-letter identifier on this airplane, DWHM. These come as you would expect them to come on vinyl decal sheets. They're easy to do. So what I do is I just kind of cut them out fairly close, pull the excess vinyl off, fold back the backing just a little bit so that I can move it around to get it where I want it, and then I'll tack down that little bit that I folded back, and then I roll the backing off the rest so that at any one time I only have maybe 1/4 or 1/2 inch of the decal exposed, so that I don't get it stuck where I don't want it or rolled up on itself and end up ruining the decal. On the other side, the H is there, and that's a narrower letter than a W, so you can see the W kind of falls over the edge of the yellow, but the H fits right inside it, just like the images that I saw. Then again, a German cross, and then the other 2 letters. And the other side is done just exactly the same way, except it's reading, you know, left to right, so the letters are reversed. So let's take a minute and just talk a little bit about how I put on the decal. I just described it to you. Now let me demonstrate it to you. Okay, so the decals for the crosses come on a single sheet or a couple of sheets of vinyl. It's pretty heavy stuff. They stick well, but they're not die cut. So every one of these you're going to have to cut out. Which the good news is these things are right angles. There's nothing complex about the curves or anything. And so just take a moment and cut them out. Now on this side you can see, I hope, that this end right here, you can see that I've taken the backing and I've cut it off. So that's sticky, but that's the only sticky part that I have showing right now. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to match this up, kind of center it on the edge here. I'm looking on the back side so it matches my other cross. I think that's where it is. And now I'm just going to tighten that down or put some pressure to put it down there on the bottom. And so now it's stuck. Now to get it on, then I'm just going to fold it up and I'm just going to roll it right off the paper. Use my fingertips to stick it on. And now I've got it on there. It didn't roll up on itself, didn't get stuck together. And because most of it was the backing, I had a lot of maneuverability to move it to get it exactly where I wanted before I tapped it down here. So technique only, but I find that works pretty well with these vinyl decals. So as you can see, I have the motor mounted to the airplane, and let me give you just a little explanation of how that occurs. The instructions are pretty good, and obviously this stuff all fits together. So first there's the box, and the box is built in such a way that the little opening here at the top where the motor wires go. So the wires from the motor go out of the motor at the top and then into the box itself. So that's the top side. It's pretty easy to identify what side is what. I labeled the top as the top. Now, as you know, with propeller airplanes, we normally mount the motors down and to the right to deal with things like torque, the difference in angle of attack of the upward rotating blade versus the downward rotating blade, and of course P factor. And the box is built in such a way that the face plate here has the down and right built in. If you look carefully, you can see that the margins around the edge of the box where this plate is are not the same, and it shows down and right. So double check that you've got down and right as you put this in. Now, the other thing that you're going to have to do as you get ready to mount your motor is you're going to have to get your radio programmed. And so I spent some time programming a new model into my radio. I have my receiver out. I hooked up some of the servos to get a sense of how they were working. But primarily I wanted to make sure the motor was rotating the right way. And the way I checked that is I just put a piece of blue painter's tape here on the bullet, get it plugged in with my radio programmed, and then run the motor to see how it rotates. And of course, when I ran it, it rotated backwards. Now, if most of your experience is with little foam airplanes that come all together, you may not be aware that the way you change that is any of the two wires that come from the motor and connect to the ESC. If you reverse any two, then it'll change directions. You know, the back electromotive force, Hall effect, whatever you want to call it, that deals with the ESC's ability to commutate the motor to know where the motor is versus the poles versus the windings, so it rotates the proper way. Changing those two wires allows you to do that, which is pretty easy to do. With that, then I put a drop of paint on both sides of that connection, a little drop of white paint and then a little drop of yellow paint, and then I left the third wire black. Because putting this together, you're going to pull them apart, and then you'll be back to where you started, and trying to get your fingers into the box to make connections would just be kind of a pain in the neck. And so with that all marked out, then I mounted the motor. I put the crossbar on the motor, put it up against the plate, used an awl to scratch a hole where I wanted the screws to go, and then I added the screws that came with the motor kit into the plate. Now, the other thing that I did is I pushed the wires from the ESC through that hole, so I was able to connect them here, and then I just pushed them back in to the box, connected properly, the paint colors matched and all that. And so I have that all ready to go. Now, the other thing that the instructions ask you to do is to check the length of the box so that the cowling fits and the motor doesn't strike the cowling. So here's the cowling, and it just slides on the yellow side up, and I position that so that I've got it far enough back. And then at this point I put the propeller on so that I would know that the propeller isn't going to strike the cowling. And so I would pull that out, pull the box in and out until I got that spacing where I wanted it to be. And then I used a pencil and drew a line along each side of the box where I'm going to use these aluminum pieces that are, a 90-degree angle to hold the box in place. And so with that line drawn, I put the plates on, marked the holes, used my thumb vise to drill the holes. And this place I ran into a little bit of confusion in that the instructions call for a 3mm by 5mm screw. and I could not find any in the kit. So it either didn't come or they've changed what they were doing, because the 2 by 10 millimeter screws, there's a ton of those. But I had 3 millimeter by 10 millimeter screws here in the workshop, and I wanted something just a little bigger since this is the whole is pulling the airplane through the air. So I used my 3 by 10 millimeter wood screws or self-tapping style screw to hold this aluminum plate on and to put it onto the front plate here or firewall of the model itself. Now, before I did that, let me rotate this for you just a little bit, and you can see that right here and then right here, those metal plates extend beyond the edge of the fuselage itself. And so I marked those, brought them over to my workbench, and used a hacksaw and just cut the corners off of that, and then used a file to smooth out the burrs and rough edges and sharp edges so that the aluminum plates fall below the fuselage itself so that the cowling will fit nicely on it. The box itself probably goes to about here. So there's a lot of extra space in this box for you to move, and then the ESC is there in the box, and the instructions also say that you're supposed to put the battery as far forward as possible to get the weight and balance right. And so since I'm not ready to check weight and balance yet, I've left the ESC loose so I don't position it in a semi-permanent place only to discover that I can't get a battery far enough forward. So something to think about there. Okay, so you can see that we have the wings mounted to the fuselage here. And so the main spar comes through here. From the inside, here is that little screw that allows the wing to pivot back. Here's the flaps, and you can see that I have the all of the covers on and the control rods connected. Now when I did that with the wings disconnected from the fuselage, connected all the servos to the receiver, and then used the various reversers and Y-connects to get it all working just out on the table where it was easy to get the connections and redo them and monkey around with them until I got everything moving the right direction and the right amount. And then with that done, I used a little metallic Sharpie to label each of the connections so that, you know, the things that I've got plugged in on the Y cords, 1 and 1, 2 and 2, and so forth. So when I took it all apart and put it into the fuselage, I didn't have to figure out all of those connections again. So I'd highly recommend labeling your connections so that you have it all together and you don't have to go through that more than once. So in this case, I've got the slats and the flaps moving together. I've got them on the same channel, and so I'll make final adjustments with the flap movement and slats in my computer radio. Out here I have the ailerons, and then here are the metal bars that support the wings. And so these you want to measure carefully. You don't want them pushing outward because that'll pull the wing away from the fuselage. It looks sloppy. And you don't want them in too tight. So this is an important measurement to make. Again, use your thumb vise to drill into the wooden blocks that are part of the wing structure under the film. And then perhaps you've noticed I've gone over the covering with a heat gun, and with that I was able to get most of the wrinkles out. It looks really nice. If you look earlier in the video, some of the tail surfaces was quite wrinkled, and they've shrunk down quite nicely. Same here along the bottom. So as we look inside the fuselage after we've connected the wings, we've got kind of a mess in there. I've got some of the wires zip tied together. I've got the receiver right down here on the floor using the sticky pad that came with the receiver. I've got the battery right here, and that's gone as far forward as those stops that are supporting the metal braces for the motor box. That's as far as the battery will go. It's a 2200 battery. And then right down here, I've got the other plug from the ESC, which I have right here and it's laying kind of upright along the side of the fuselage so that I can get the battery in as tight as it can. I've got a little Velcro on the floor there to help hold it secure, and then I've got all of these connections labeled. When I was putting the wings together, I got them all labeled, so when I got it through these holes, I was able to reconnect them all without having to experiment to figure out which one goes where. Now, the model comes with a seat. If you wanted to mess with it, you could probably get it in there after you put the battery in. It's not something I cared about, so I left it out. The other thing that you'll notice here in a minute when we get a view of the entire thing with this cover put on, I chose not to put on the machine gun. It has a little triangle piece that goes through the plastic, which should give it some good support, but the plastic's pretty thin, and it would be a real easy thing to hit the machine gun and then break the top of the model, that thin plastic, so I chose not to mount the machine guns. So here we have the Storch on the CG machine, and I ended up putting in a little weight in the nose. I got about 1.5 ounces of weight stuck right in here at the very front of the cowling. I've got the battery as far forward as it will come, but you remember when we put the metal bars to support the box, the motor box, we added support on the inside so screws had something to grab on, and so that is as far as I can put the battery in. So I did end up having to add a little weight. It's pretty well balanced right now. I may end up adding a little bit more weight because I usually like to fly slightly nose heavy, but we'll give this a flight before we start messing with the CG very much. So there it is on the CG machine, right at 75 millimeters from the leading edge of the slat on the wings. As you can see from the build, the Dancing Wing model's Storch is a nice model that was a very enjoyable project. The parts fit together well, with a little sanding on some of the support blocks being the biggest adjustments. The landing gear assembly was easy but stiff. Be sure to identify the mounting blocks under the film covering to ensure that you get the screws firmly mounted. The slots for the rudder and ailerons were tight. Reserve some time to enlarge them a little bit to ensure a snug but smooth fit for the CA hinges. I used a 6-channel receiver and a couple of Y-cords and servo reversers to get the flaps and slats on one channel. That took a bit of experimenting to get the right servos on the correct Y-cord and the proper line equipped with the servo reverser. Take your time and just know that you'll be making some adjustments. Be sure to do the measurements on the control throws and CG before going out to fly. Since you've not only made an investment in the cost of the model, you've also invested a bunch of time. Balsa models don't deal well with crashes as well as foam models do, so double and triple check everything before your maiden flight. Last, this was a fun model to assemble. If you haven't tried a balsa ARF before, this model from Dancing Wings and Bitgo Hobby would make a good project for the foam airplane pilot wanting to add to their modeling skills. Again, if you found this video helpful, please click the thumbs up button below the video and subscribe to the RC Planeviews channel. Click the bell icon to be notified when I post new videos. Thanks for watching.